These are the 5 stations that turn raw ore into a blessed weapon, and this is what it looks like to walk that line from end to end. Somewhere in the Imperium of man, on a world whose sky has not been blue in 10,000 years, a furnace is lit, and 40 minutes later a soldier's rifle comes off the far end of the line, stamped, tested and sung over by a priest who is also a machine. This is the story of how a lasgun is made, not in the abstract, but station by station, the way a quality control officer would actually walk it. Some of what follows is settled canon, the STC system, the doctrine of Mars, the role of the tech priest, the existence of standard patterns and the ritual language used around them. Some of it, the exact floor layout, the specific sequence of a single line, the texture of one Forge World's shift, is dramatization built on top of that canon, because no rulebook has ever published a shift schedule for a manufactorum. Where the line between the two matters, this video will say so plainly. Before there is a factory, there has to be a design, and in the Imperium the design is not supposed to be an idea a person had. It is supposed to be older than the person standing in front of it. The core of Imperial industry is the standard template construct system, the STC. In the fiction, an STC is a data template from the dark age of technology, humanity's lost golden age of super science, encoding the complete manufacturing specification for a piece of equipment, not just what it looks like, but every tolerance, every alloy ratio, every step required to build it from raw material with no design work required at all. The promise of an STC is that a world with the right template and the right machines can produce a perfect copy of a weapon that was already perfect 10,000 years before that world's forge was lit. The Lasgun is the signature product of that promise. It is not the most powerful weapon the Imperium fields, and nobody in the setting claims that it is. Its virtue is that it is simple, rugged, and endlessly reproducible, and that its power source, a rechargeable cell rather than disposable ammunition, means a soldier standing in front of nothing but sunlight and time can, in principle, keep it running indefinitely. Games Workshop's own background material has described the Lasgun as the most common weapon in the galaxy for exactly this reason. It is not chosen because it is the best rifle that could be built. It is chosen because it is the rifle that can be built again and again and again on 1,000 different worlds by workforces that range from skilled artisans to servitors that used to be people. That reproducibility is why this factory exists and why factories nearly identical to it exist across the Imperium. A forge world under the authority of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the machine cult that treats technology as a species of religion, does not design weapons so much as it venerates a template and reproduces it as faithfully as ritual and industrial capacity allow. The priesthood that runs these worlds are the tech priests, and to them the acts of manufacturing are not separable from worship. A production line, in this framework, is a form of liturgy. That is not a joke or an exaggeration in the fiction. It is the literal doctrine of the cult Mechanicus, and it is why almost every station on the tour ahead has both an engineering function and a ritual one layered on top of it. It's worth being honest here about the shape of what's coming, what the Mechanicus believes about its own machines, that the machine god dwells within them, that a weapon has a spirit that must be placated, is presented in the fiction as sincere belief within the setting, not verified physics of the 40K universe. The tour that follows treats that belief the way the setting treats it, as real to the people performing it, and as the organizing logic of everything you're about to see, whether or not you'd call it true. The tour begins the way the weapon begins, with rock. The Forge World's manufacturing base sits on top of, or next to, enormous mineral extraction operations, strip mines, deep shafts, orbital slag hauling from asteroid belts, whatever the local geology and system allow. The Lasgun's structural components are, in the fiction, built from ferrocrete-adjacent alloys and hardened plastics or ceramite compounds depending on pattern and world, and none of that starts as anything recognizable as a rifle. It starts as ore, and the first thing that happens to it is heat. Furnace halls on a forge world are described across Imperial fiction as some of the loudest, hottest, most spiritually significant spaces on the planet, because smelting is treated as a kind of purification rite as much as a chemical one. Impurities are burned or skimmed away, alloy ratios are set, and the resulting ingots or billets are the raw stock that every later station will cut, press, and shape. This is also where a tech priest performs one of the earliest formal blessings on the line, not on the finished weapon, but on the metal itself, asking that it hold true through the processes to come. Whether you read that as superstition or as an institutional habit that happens to enforce quality discipline, the effect described in the fiction is the same. Nothing proceeds to machining until it has, in the eyes of the priesthood present, been made ready. The other resource born at this station, and unique to the Lasgun specifically, is the las crystal, sometimes called a focusing crystal, the component responsible for shaping and amplifying the weapon's beam. Depending on which era and source you're drawing from, these crystals are described as grown, refined, or cut, and different patterns and forge worlds are canonically known to use different crystal sourcing and cutting traditions, which is part of why Lasguns from different worlds are recognizably different in performance and appearance even though they're nominally the same gun. This factory grows its own, in a separate cleaner annex off the main furnace hall, because a flawed crystal ruins every station after it. From the furnace hall, stock metal moves to the machining floor, and this is where the rifle starts to look like a rifle. Receivers, barrels, and housings are cut, milled, and pressed to the tolerances the STC specifies, and this is a station where the fiction is explicit that tolerance is not a suggestion. A standard template construct isn't a rough blueprint that leaves room for local craftsmanship. It's presented as an exact manufacturing specification, and Mechanicus doctrine treats deviation from it as something close to heresy, not just a quality defect. In practice, on a heavily mechanized forge world, that tolerance is enforced by servo-arms, laser cutters, and press machines running to a program, with skilled artisans and tech priests supervising rather than hand-cutting every part. Though less industrialized worlds and lower tech patterns of Lasgun are canonically built with far more manual labor, sometimes by menial or indentured populations working presses and lathes by hand under overseer supervision. Barrels are bored, and the internal channel that will carry the beam is finished to a mirror tolerance, because any imperfection there scatters the beam and weakens the shot. Housings for the power cell and trigger mechanism are cut as a separate batch and queued for the next station. This is also dramatically where the factory is loudest and most visually chaotic. The sparks, the grinding, the servo arms moving in patterns that look almost choreographed because the program genuinely is a fixed sequence repeated thousands of times a shift. None of the individual cutting steps shown on a tour like this are drawn from a published, line-by-line Games Workshop machining manual. No such document exists, but the presence of servo-arm milling, press forming, and laser cutting as Forge World manufacturing methods is consistent with how Adeptus Mechanicus industry is generally depicted. Assembly is where the separate lines, receiver, barrel, housing, crystal, power cell, converge into a single object for the first time, and it's also where the factory's ritual character is most visible to an outside observer, because this is where the blessing of the machine happens in its fullest form. The mechanical work itself is straightforward to describe. The barrel is fitted and locked to the receiver, the las crystal is seated in its housing along the beam path, the trigger and firing mechanism are installed, the stock is attached, and the rechargeable power cell, the component that makes the Lasgun distinct from ammunition-fed small arms, is fitted into its housing at the weapon's rear or underside, depending on pattern. Some of this is done by hand, particularly on lower tech or more traditional Forge World lines. Some of it is done by servo-arm or by menial labor under a tech priest's direct oversight, again depending on the world and the pattern being produced. Both approaches are consistent with how the setting depicts Mechanicus manufacturing, which varies considerably by world rather than following one uniform industrial process. What's specific to this station, and well attested in Adeptus Mechanicus background material, is the ritual overlay on top of the mechanical steps. The cult Mechanicus holds that machines possess a spirit, a machine spirit, that must be honored, not merely operated, and that a newly assembled weapon in particular needs to be properly woken and placated before it is trusted to function. This takes the form of a blessing, incense, chanted litany in binary cant or high Gothic, anointing oils applied to the weapon's casing, and formal rites performed by a tech priest before the weapon is considered complete rather than merely assembled. This isn't a colorful flourish added for the tour. It's presented in the fiction as doctrinally central to how the Mechanicus understands its own industrial output, to the point that a weapon that skipped the rite would, in the internal logic of the setting, be considered spiritually incomplete even if it were mechanically identical to one that received it. I'll admit the detail that actually stuck with me researching this wasn't the sparks or the servo arms. It was realizing the blessing rite and the calibration rig back at the testing station are doing the exact same job. A tech priest chanting litany over a freshly assembled housing and a technician checking beam focus tolerance on a rig are both quality control. They're just running on two completely different belief systems, and the setting never makes you pick which one is the real reason the gun ends up working. It's worth flagging plainly. The exact wording of any blessing litany used in this dramatization is not a verified sourced quotation from a specific Black Library novel or Games Workshop rulebook. This video does not put words in a tech priest's mouth and claim they're canon. What is canon is the existence and doctrinal centrality of the practice itself. Nothing leaves this floor without being tested, and testing on a Mechanicus line is not a spot check. It is closer to an inquisition of the object itself. Assembled weapons are moved to calibration rigs first, clamped into a fixed frame, connected to diagnostic equipment that checks beam focus, power cell charge and discharge rates, and mechanical tolerance against the STC specification the weapon is supposed to match exactly. A weapon that passes calibration moves to live fire testing, where it's fired a set number of times into a containment range to confirm it performs under actual discharge conditions rather than just passing a static check. Readouts are checked by a tech priest, and anything outside tolerance doesn't get remachined and sent back through, canonically and practically, on an assembly line running at industrial scale. A rejected weapon or component is typically stripped for reclaimable material, and the batch is investigated, because the deeper assumption on a forge world is that if the STC-derived process was followed correctly, the fault lies in an input or a step, not in the design itself, and process failures need to be found and corrected rather than patched around. This is also, dramatically, the coldest lit station on the tour by design. Away from the sodium work lights of the machining and assembly floors, testing bays tend to run under harsher, bluer inspection lighting, because this is a station about verification and scrutiny rather than production, and the shift in light is one honest way to show that shift in purpose, without inventing dialogue to explain it. The weapons that pass testing are pattern tagged, stamped with a batch and manufactory marking, and moved to the final station, crating and dispatch. This is the least ritually dramatic station, and the most administratively important one. Crates are stenciled with contents, batch number, and destination, often a requisition code tied to a specific regiment, garrison world, or Departamento Manufactorum tithe order, because Lasgun production at this scale exists to arm the Astra Militarum, the Imperium's vast conscripted army, and a forge world's output is frequently earmarked well before it's finished. Crates are stacked, tagged and loaded onto transports, surface haulers, orbital lighters, or directly into the hold of a waiting starship depending on where the shipment is headed and how urgently it's needed. A garrison world tithe might move by slow bulk freighter over months. A war zone resupply, in wartime, moves as fast as the manufactorum's logistics network can manage, which the fiction generally treats as impressive by necessity and imperfect by nature. The Imperium's supply lines are canonically vast, but also canonically strained, and shortages, misdirected shipments, and worlds waiting on overdue tithes are recurring, acknowledged features of the setting rather than an oversight in this video's research. And then the crate is gone, onto a transport, off the world, headed for a regiment that may be light years away and months from receiving it, to be issued to a soldier who will likely never know which forge, which furnace hall, which tech priest's blessing produced the weapon in their hands. That anonymity is, in its own way, the point of the whole system. The STC promise was never that any one weapon would be special. It was that the process could be trusted to make millions of them exactly the same, forever, without anyone having to reinvent the rifle from nothing. It's worth pausing on who, and what, actually staffs a line like this, because factory undersells how strange the workforce is by the standards of any world outside the Imperium. At the top of the hierarchy are the tech priests themselves, members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, often extensively augmented with cybernetic limbs, sensory implants, and in some cases so much replacement machinery that little of the original body remains. On the fictional page, and in miniature range artwork across multiple editions of Warhammer 40,000, senior tech priests overseeing a forge floor are consistently shown with multiple mechadendrites, mechanical, tentacle-like tool arms sprouting from the back or shoulders that let a single supervisor physically interface with several machines or components at once. That's not incidental factory dressing. It reflects the doctrine that the ideal tech-priest relationship to a machine is direct, near physical union, not remote operation from behind a console. Below them, the actual labor varies enormously by world and by how much of the process has been automated. Some forge worlds lean almost entirely on servitors, lobotomized cyborg laborers, once human, stripped of independent will and fitted with tools or weapons in place of hands, used for exactly the kind of repetitive, dangerous, or unpleasant industrial labor a press line or a furnace floor demands. Their use is depicted across Adeptus Mechanicus background material as standard practice, not an aberration, and it's one of the setting's more openly grim details. Servitors are described in universe as recycled criminals, indentured citizens, or those judged to have failed the machine god in some other way, their prior identity erased in the conversion. Other forge worlds, or other stations within the same forge world, rely instead on ordinary human menial labor, indentured or tithed workers doing the physically demanding parts of the job by hand, under a tech priest's supervision, with none of the cybernetic augmentation the priesthood itself carries. A single tour like the one this video follows would plausibly cross both kinds of labor in different rooms, because the Mechanicus is not depicted as running one uniform staffing model across every world it controls. Forge worlds differ enormously from each other in wealth, population, technological sophistication, and how automated their lines actually are. That variation matters for honesty's sake. Nothing in this video should be read as claiming there is one single, standardized Forge World factory floor that every manufactorum in the Imperium replicates. What's standardized is the template and the doctrine, the floor plan, the exact split between servo-arm and human hand, the specific mix of servitor and menial labor, that's local, and it's exactly the kind of detail this tour dramatizes rather than sources to a specific book. The doctrine underpinning everything on this tour traces back, in the fiction, to Mars, homeworld of the Adeptus Mechanicus and, alongside Terra, one of the two great seats of Imperial authority. Mars is depicted across multiple editions of Warhammer 40,000 background material as the origin and ultimate authority of the cult Mechanicus, the body that controls the majority of the Imperium's STC fragments, sets doctrine for how templates are to be interpreted and used, and dispatches or licenses forge worlds throughout the Imperium to manufacture from Mars-sanctioned patterns. A forge world is not, in this framework, an independent industrial actor free to reinterpret a design. It operates under a covenant with Mars, and deviation from sanctioned pattern and process is treated, in the fiction, as a serious doctrinal matter, sometimes literally prosecuted as heresy against the machine god, not merely flagged as a manufacturing defect. That's also why the Lasgun itself is not one single object but a family of patterns, recognized, sanctioned variants that differ by forge world of origin, caliber, stock design, and accessory fitting, while sharing the same underlying STC-derived function. Background material across editions has described multiple named Lasgun patterns, and the closely related Lasgun, a shorter, lighter-barreled version of the same core design intended for closer quarters or specialist roles, built from the same doctrine and largely the same station-by-station process this tour follows, just to different tolerances and a different final shape. A soldier's opinion of their Lasgun pattern and rivalries between regiments over whose forge world makes the better rifle are a recurring, lightly humanized detail in Astra Militarum focused fiction, a reminder that behind the industrial abstraction of a million worlds each making the same gun, there are still soldiers who know and care which factory floor their weapon came from. Here's a reference chit worth pausing on. Laid side by side, the Cantrell, Acatran, and Lucius patterns share the same STC bones but wear different stocks and barrel lengths, which is the whole supply chain argument in one image. Step back from the single factory floor, and the significance of this process becomes clearer. The Imperium of man spans roughly 1 million worlds, by its own internal reckoning, and fields the largest standing military force depicted in the setting, built substantially around basic infantry armed with exactly this weapon. That's only possible because the Lasgun was designed, or rather, preserved, as something buildable at scale by workforces of wildly varying skill and technological sophistication, on 1,000 different forge worlds that don't need to coordinate a shared design process, because the design isn't supposed to change. Every manufactorum like the one on this tour is a load-bearing piece of that math, not glamorous, rarely depicted in the setting's more dramatic fiction, but structurally necessary to an Imperium that measures its wars in decades and its army in billions. It also explains something that trips people up when they first encounter this setting: why a civilization with access to far more powerful individual weapons, plasma guns, melter weapons, the terrifying arsenal fielded by space marines, still equips the overwhelming majority of its soldiers with what is, by the numbers, a comparatively modest rifle. The answer sitting on this factory floor is supply. A plasma gun that can't be reliably reproduced at the scale of Forge World like this one. Turns out Lasguns is a weapon for elites, not for an army measured in the billions. The Lasgun's mediocrity, if you want to call it that, is inseparable from its ubiquity, and its ubiquity is inseparable from exactly the kind of factory this tour just walked through. STC-locked, ritual-bound, and built to make the same rifle, correctly, forever. No tour of a functioning line is complete without acknowledging what happens when this system breaks, because the setting is explicit that it does break, regularly, and that the failure modes are as much a part of Imperial history as the successes. STC fragments are, in the fiction, incomplete far more often than they are whole. The dark age of technology ended in catastrophe. The setting refers to this collapse as the Age of Strife, and the vast majority of STC data was lost, corrupted, or scattered across worlds no living tech priest can reach. What the Mechanicus actually possesses, on most worlds, is not a pristine complete template for a Lasgun but a patched, centuries-accumulated body of doctrine, partial data, and empirically verified workarounds treated with the same reverence as a genuine STC fragment, because in practice they have to be trusted the same way. This is part of why Lasgun patterns differ so much from world to world. Some of that variation is sanctioned regional taste, and some of it is quietly the product of a forge world working from an imperfect template, and filling the gaps with generations of accumulated tradition, rather than admitting the original data was never complete. When a forge world's process genuinely fails, a batch that doesn't pass testing at a rate the priesthood considers acceptable, a furnace that can't hold the alloy ratio a pattern demands, a last crystal supply that degrades, the fictional consequence is not a shrug and a memo. It's treated as a doctrinal crisis, investigated with the same intensity as heresy, because in the internal logic of the cult Mechanicus, a failing machine spirit or a broken process is evidence that something has gone spiritually as well as mechanically wrong. Whole subplots across Adeptus Mechanicus focused fiction turn on exactly this: a forge world's output failing a war zone at the worst possible moment, and the resulting scramble to find out whether the fault lies in the ore, the crystal, the ritual, or something closer to sabotage or corruption. This video won't invent a specific such crisis and present it as documented history. No verified account of this exact factory's worst day exists to cite, but the pattern of how the Mechanicus responds to failure is well and consistently established across the setting's background material. That's the honest shape of the story, where this video described the furnace hall, the machining floor, the blessing rite, the testing bays, and the shipping yard. It built on settled Adeptus Mechanicus doctrine, the STC system, the cult Mechanicus's belief in machine spirits, the existence of standard patterns, and the Lascabine variant, the Mars-centered authority structure, the use of servitors and menial labor, and the Lasgun's designed role as the Imperium's mass-issue rifle, where it walked a specific route through a specific factory, with a specific order of rooms and a specific texture to one shift on one world. That's dramatization built to make an abstract industrial doctrine visible and concrete, the way no single sourcebook has ever laid it out room by room. The forge worlds that actually do this work, across roughly 1 million worlds and 10,000 years, don't share one floor plan, one staffing model, or even one complete copy of the original template, but they share the same reverence for the process, the same rites performed over the same kind of steel, and the same reason for existing, to make sure that somewhere, on some world, in some furnace hall lit by fire older than most civilizations humanity has ever known, another Lasgun is always coming off the line, anonymous, identical to 1 billion others, and exactly as it was designed to be 10,000 years ago.